An orchard in need of renovation implies an orchard suffering from neglect, and neglect is personal. The personal side of growing fruit, the personal equation, or the man behind the tree, is always an important factor in successful fruit culture. Perhaps it is the most important factor. U.S. Department of Agriculture Farmers Bulletin, number 1284, from 1922. Welcome to Vintage Americana, exploring and restoring rural American culture. I'm your hostess, Holly, and today we're going to talk about propagating fruits that are useful to you, the person behind the tree. Leave behind the limited selection at the big box stores and learn the ins and outs of grafting, cutting, layering, and trading varieties with other people who maintain heirloom fruit. All of these techniques provide an easy, low-tech way to clone the fruit plants you want. And having varieties and types of fruit that are appropriate to your climate and needs is an important step toward real food security. Every farmhouse once had a few trees and bushes nearby, a habit we need to reclaim. Let's start with fruit trees, because we've already touched on some of this in an earlier episode, and because there is a vibrant fruit explorer community to tap into. Most fruit trees, apples, peaches, cherries, plums, etc., don't grow true from seed. So if you buy a Honeycrisp apple at the store and plant one of the seeds, you won't get a Honeycrisp apple tree. The tree you do get will be something between a Honeycrisp as one parent and an unknown tree that provided the pollen for the other. It might be something even better than a Honeycrisp, or it might be completely inedible. Most likely, it will fall within these extremes and give you a decent apple that is nothing to write home about. It may or may not retain certain improved characteristics for disease resistance, bloom time, ripening time, and so forth. Effectively, planting seeds for fruit trees is too much of a gamble for most people, especially since it will be a few years before you even know if the fruit is worthwhile. It's much more common to graft a tree of a known variety. Grafting is the art and craft of taking a woody cutting from the tree you want to grow and affixing it to a root or short stem of another variety in such a way that they fuse together into a single tree. This way, you can take those seedling apples you might have planted and get them to bear your choice of variety of apples. It works with a lot of other woody plants, from other fruit and nut trees to grapevines. Apples are famously easy to graft and very useful to the independent farmstead. I'll refer you to my earlier episode, The Appling of America, to get the details on how rootstock and the scion, or your cutting, interact. I'm going to start with the presumption that you've got some sort of rootstock to graft on, whether purchased or started from seed. Most people graft apple trees in the very early spring. The idea is for the rootstock to be breaking dormancy before the grafted scion, so that the graft has started to heal before the buds on the scion really start to break. Where do you get scion wood? Lots of places. It depends on what you'd like to grow. There are a number of large heritage orchards across the country that will happily sell scion wood. The USDA test station in Geneva, New York will send you some free of charge, although not this year because of a fire blight outbreak. There are even groups that meet locally or online who trade or sell scion wood to each other. Typically, with apples, scion wood is harvested in late winter. It can be stored in a refrigerator until grafting time. This is also the case for pears. I'll link some videos in the show notes because grafting is easier to understand by watching than via description. But the idea is to get a small twig of the desired variety to either replace the main stem of the tree or to become a new branch on it. Stone fruits like peaches, cherries, and plums can be grafted the same way, although they're a little fussier. It's not unusual to get a 90% success rate when grafting apple trees. but the average backyard orchardist might struggle to get better than 60 to 70% for stone fruits. Because stone fruits like to be quite a bit warmer in order to heal the graft site, some people prefer to bud graft them rather than to graft on an entire stick of scion wood. Budding involves just what it says: cutting a bud from your scion wood, slitting the bark of the recipient, and compressing the pieces together until the graft site heals. Both types of graft involve lining up the growing layer, the cambium, of the scion and the rootstock, and then holding the pieces together until they fuse. The most common technique for budding is to use a sharp knife to remove a bud from the scion wood, leaving an oval base for it. This makes sure that all of the bud tissue is included in the graft. Then, 2 slits are made in the bark of the tree to be grafted onto, in the shape of a T. Done during the growing season when the bark is slipping, the bud can be slid down into the cut under the bark. It's then wrapped tightly to make sure that everything stays in good contact. With some skill and a little luck, the bud will become a new branch, and the fruit on that branch will be that of the scion wood. Both grafting and budding can be used on a small seedling tree to make the resulting tree the new variety. Or they can be used for what is called top working. If you have an apple tree whose fruit you don't care for, or that bears poorly, so long as the issue is not the overall health of the tree, but just a poor choice of variety for the conditions, it can be top worked. This involves pruning back branches and grafting in scions to change what variety they bear. Even large branches can be reworked in this way, with the scion wood simply slipped in between the bark and the wood of the branch where it has been cut off. There is some risk involved in leaving large open cuts on a tree, and this should be properly painted or covered until the tree heals the wound. Much faster to rehabilitate a tree by top working than it is to cut down and replant. You'll get apples from your new branches years sooner than a newly planted tree would bear. The other use for top working is creating what have become known as Frankentrees or fruit salad trees. There is no reason that you can't work a tree to have a different variety on each branch. Some people have made Frankentrees that have 100 or more apple varieties on a single tree. Personally, I find this a bit extreme, as it means you'll only have a couple apples of each variety come harvest time. But if your space is limited, it's certainly an option. And so is having a few trees that each have 2 to 3 varieties on them. Fruit salad trees take this idea a step further and graft a different fruit onto a single tree in several locations. There are limits to this, of course. The varieties grafted must be botanically closely related enough to be compatible. But you'll find trees that combine peaches, nectarines, apricots, plums, and sometimes hybrids like pluots and apriums. Cherries, though a stone fruit, seem to be difficult to get to join the party. I've not heard much about whether hybrids of a cherry, like a pluary, can be successfully added to either type of tree. This also works with citrus trees if you're in an area where citrus can be grown. A single tree can support branches with oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruit, and so on. Grafting can also be used to clone yourself whatever varieties you like of fig, persimmon, mulberries, pawpaws, and all sorts of nuts. With a bit of practice, a grafting knife, wax, and parafilm, you can build yourself a home orchard suited to your needs and climate. There are well over 7,000 named varieties of apples alone. Don't limit yourself to what's available at the local nursery or from a national catalog. So, again, where do you get this scion wood? There are lots of smaller commercial orchards, Fedco Trees, Maple Valley, Burnt Ridge, and there are nonprofits that preserve heritage fruit varieties and will sell wood as both a way to conserve those varieties and also to fund their own operations, like the Temperate Orchard Conservancy. There are local swaps and clubs, and there are online sources. Try NAFX, the North American Fruit Explorers. They have both a website and a Facebook group. There is also a North American scion trading Facebook group dedicated to the swapping of varieties of wood from one user to another. Do use a bit of caution when getting scion from random folks. Make sure to sanitize them before you graft with a dilute bleach solution, and be aware that there is some potential for bringing disease into your orchard. The USDA also provides germplasm, scion wood as a rule, for many varieties of tree. As I mentioned earlier, the Geneva Test Station, home of most of the apple collection, is currently closed to requests due to a fire blight outbreak. The Davis, California station has most of the stone fruit collection, but is much less reliable about actually sending out scion wood. Vining fruits can also be grafted. Grapes, hardy kiwi, maypop, and tropical passion fruit, again if your climate will allow. Grapes are grafted for much the same reasons as tree fruit: disease resistance, changing the variety on a vine to something more useful, or to make use of characteristics regarding blossom and harvest timing. Wine grapes are largely grafted, as the European varieties winemakers prefer to use are quite sensitive to disease, and the American rootstocks are quite resistant. For table grapes, it's possible to find resistant own root varieties, but it's also certainly possible to graft multiple varieties onto a single vine. Grafting hardy kiwi does all that, and more. Kiwi require a male and a female plant in order to set fruit. The male vines, however, don't do much but provide that pollination, and can be prone to taking up lots of space. Instead, it's possible to graft a male vine onto a female vine. This helps save space and still provides pollination for fruit set. Kiwi are a little trickier to graft, so I suggest hitting a forum like growingfruit.org for tips. Passion fruit can be grown if your climate is nearly tropical, but the lesser-known maypop is a variety of passion fruit native to North America and hardy to zone 5 or so, depending on the variety. If you've got the space for vines, it's an interesting addition to the homestead garden. And if you're borderline for tropical passion fruit, grafting onto a maypop root might improve your hardiness a little bit. Another means of propagating fruit plants is via cuttings. In general, cuttings are made by snipping off a segment from a healthy plant, then sticking the cut end into a growing medium until it roots. It is, of course, both exactly that simple and quite a bit more complicated. One thing that is a must for rooting cuttings is a good, appropriate soil or medium to put your cuttings into. It's important to keep things moist. The lack of a good root system makes it difficult for the cuttings to take up water and nutrients. However, don't waterlog them or they'll rot. It's also not a bad idea to improve your chances by dipping the end of your cutting in rooting hormone before placing it in the medium. You can buy rooting hormone at any well-stocked nursery or find it online from nursery supply sites. It's also possible to make your own from willow twigs. Willow cuttings are famous for rooting if you so much as look at them sideways, so this is a way to put that trait to use for you. I'll put a link in the show notes for directions. Blueberries, cranberries, and lingonberries are primarily produced from cuttings. With all three, you'll want to take softwood cuttings. That means the pliable stems that have not yet become woody and brittle, about 5 to 8 inches long. Strip off the lower leaves so that there are just a few remaining at the top. Dip the bottom end into rooting hormone, knock off the excess, and place in your rooting medium. All three prefer light, nutrient-rich medium that leans acidic. Make a hole for your cutting with a pencil so that you don't strip off all the rooting hormone, and don't pack them in too tightly. Within a couple of months, you should get bright green shoots. Pot them up and keep them in containers for the first year, fertilizing often with seaweed or fish emulsion. They can be planted out in the garden next year. Raspberries and blackberries root readily and is best done in summer with this year's canes. Snip off a branch tip that's about 8 to 12 inches long, strip off the bottom few leaves, dip in your rooting hormone, and place them in your medium. Brambles, raspberries and blackberries, will set up a good root system pretty readily, and you can plant them out in the fall. Currants and gooseberries often root better from older wood and are cut in the fall. Choose sections of 2 to 4 year old branches that are healthy with a number of buds on them. The usual method of hormone and medium applies. They can be overwintered in a low tunnel in containers or planted directly in the ground and then thoroughly mulched. It is also possible to hold currant and gooseberry cuttings in the refrigerator over the winter and root them in the spring, using a method that is mostly soaking them until roots appear. That's a little more tricky, but I will again include a little link for you in the show notes. Nanking cherries are another fruit that propagates well from cuttings, although they're a bit more particular. Take softwood cuttings in the summer, strip the leaves off the bottom half of your cutting, hormone, rooting medium, etc. However, Nanking cherry cuttings will die if the leaves dry out, so plan on misting them repeatedly. Set a reminder in your phone and leave them alone until they go dormant in the fall, and then you can set them out in their new location. Fig trees and mulberries can also be propagated by cuttings. Figs, in particular, are a little fussy. Fig cuttings root best with some sort of greenhouse conditions supplied, so I'll suggest that you do some research if this is something you want to try. Note that this doesn't mean that you have to have a greenhouse, just that you need to provide warmth and humidity. Some combination of a heat mat and an enclosure can provide that, but they're definitely a little more challenging to get going than other fruits. Mulberries also like greenhouse conditions. Softwood cuttings taken in late winter can be kept in medium in some sort of protected, warm, moist environment, and by late spring, the cuttings should have leaves and be ready to plant out. Cuttings are an excellent way to increase your fruit plantings for free or nearly free, but they're also a great method of getting new varieties from other folks. Cuttings can be transported easily. Packaged well and sent at an appropriate time of year, they can even be shipped through the mail. This is a great way to try varieties that you can't get your hands on from commercial sources. Again, the growingfruit.org forum has lots of threads for trading cuttings. You can also check on home orchard, homestead, and gardening threads to see if anybody has what you want. Perhaps you'll even manage to get your hands on some cuttings of the ever-elusive black Nanking cherry. The next method of propagation we'll talk about is layering. Lots of plants will start to root from branches if they end up buried in the ground. Brambles, in particular, tend to reproduce this way in nature. The cane leans over until it's touching the ground and then starts to get covered over with leaf mold and soil. Roots form on the covered portion of the cane, and soon a new berry plant has started. It's pretty easy to encourage this behavior. Take a supple branch that's already close to the ground. Dig a little trench, then gently press the branch into it. The portion attached to and closest to the mother plant should not be buried. You can leave the far end free as well so that the branch can feed itself. Pin the branch firmly into the ground with some large wires bent into staple shapes, and then fill in the trench. In time, you'll see shoots start to come up from the buried branch. Give them a season to build a root system, and then the branch can be dug up and clipped off to separate out each new plant, at which point they're ready to plant out in the garden. Layering suckers from apple trees is a way of propagating rootstocks, but that's something of another topic. Currants, gooseberries, cranberries, and lingonberries are all also good candidates for layering. More upright plants can sometimes be difficult to manipulate a branch low enough to layer. In these cases, air layering can be used. To air layer a plant, find a nice, healthy-looking 1 to 2 year old branch. About 18 to 24 inches from the tip, use a sharp knife to peel the bark off a section of the branch about 1 inch long and no more than 1/3 of the diameter. Don't cut too deeply, but be sure to get past the green cambium layer or it will simply scar over. Wrap the wound you've made with damp sphagnum moss, then plastic wrap, sealing both ends. You'll probably need to open it periodically to keep it moist, and it may take up to a year to develop a root system, but once it does, you can snip it off below the roots and plant it. Blueberries and some trees are occasionally propagated by air layering. You can simply dig and split some fruit-bearing plants to get more. Currant or gooseberry bushes as well as rhubarb can be divided this way. The downside is that you turn your mature plant into smaller individuals again and may sacrifice your fruit production for that year in so doing. Strawberries can be divided in the early spring, but it's fairly difficult to do correctly without killing the plant, and again sacrifices your current crop, as the plant must now focus on recovery instead of bearing fruit. A much better way of propagating strawberries is rooting runners. One of the most famous characteristics of the strawberry plant is its tendency to produce runners, long stems that arc out horizontally from the mother plant, then form a small cluster of leaves at the tip, which usually roots and forms into a new plant. If you'd like to transplant these, it's pretty easy to direct each new plantlet into a small pot buried a little ways into the ground. Kept moist, they usually root pretty quickly, and then can be separated from the mother plant and used to plant a new strawberry bed. Since strawberry plants only bear really well for a couple years, this is a great way of keeping things going without having to reorder new plants every few years. Propagating your own fruit plants is a great way to close the loop on production of your favorites. Once you've established a small selection of garden plants, you can continue to make more until you've reached your desired planting density. And let's face it, fruit plants and trees are expensive. Using these techniques also means you're not dependent on the few varieties available from commercial nurseries. Lots of these are not necessarily the tastiest fruits. They may have been selected to bear larger fruits, for easy growing characteristics, or sometimes even for use in small commercial settings. For the home gardener or independent farmstead, there are often better choices out there, just not handily packaged up for grab-and-go sales. Growing, propagating, and trading fruit trees and plants is also a function of the neighboring behavior that helps to build farmsteading communities, both in person and virtually. I've mentioned the growingfruit.org forum repeatedly, but it's hard to overemphasize the depth and breadth of varieties of fruit grown by the people who hang out there. Most of them are generous souls. If you're not greedy and show a genuine interest, there is likely someone there who can provide you with what you need. And often they'll do it for a swap with something you've got, or just for the cost of shipping. Don't forget, too, that making new plants can be a useful side hustle. Rooted cuttings ready for the garden in small pots are one of the first things that can hit the farm stand in the spring. Help reintroduce people to the pleasures of heritage fruits and varieties. Do remember that lots of folks have never even had some of them. So, for instance, if you're going to sell lingonberry plants at the market, consider bringing along a jar of preserves and some crackers to taste test what you can do with the resulting fruit. This is a good time as well to touch very briefly on the topic of keeping a farmstead journal. I'll cover this in depth later, but one thing about fruit trees and shrubs is that their longevity tends to lead toward an opportunity to forget which variety is which, especially if you've grafted yourself a frankentree. Two things can help with this. The first is good labeling. Emphasis on good labeling. There does not exist a single marker that won't fade over the life of the tree. Look instead at soft metal labels. You can write on them with a pen and it will emboss the words into the metal. These last much longer. The second is to keep a journal. Get in the habit of noting what you have planted and where. Add in new varieties as you plant them. Try to keep track of where you obtained them, in case it dies and you might need to ask for another cutting, for example. Tracking how different plants were propagated also helps you determine what works best for you. There is a wide and vibrant community of folks out there happily maintaining and promoting off-the-wall varieties and fruits. They're always happy to have more company. And the oldies are often the best for small farm and homestead uses. You'll find the options endless and the people helpful. For instance, I have an extensive guide to grafting apricots that someone sent me, along with some rootstock. And stored in my fridge are some scions I cut this spring from a couple of apricot trees that are well over 100 years old. Let's go have a try at cloning these grand dames of the fruit world. Are you coming?